And again, thank you for joining us on the third day of Hindu Dharma, Hindutva, and Hindu Desha. And it is my pleasure to introduce Sri Kalyan Vishwanathan, President of Hindu University of America. Kalyanji, let me just hand it off to you so you can give a broader context of today's two panels.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Ankur. And I would be remiss if we did not introduce Dr. J. Bansal, who's here with us from the Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America. He's certainly a very important partner in putting this event on. JG, thank you very much. And let me begin by welcoming Shri Sanjay Dixit. Sanjay ji, thank you very, very much for joining us from India in the midst of your very busy schedule. Okay. Namaskar.
My pleasure.
So a very quick introduction to Sanjay Dixit ji. You all probably know him already. He's currently famous for his stewardship of the Jaipur Dialogues as its chairman. But formerly, he was additional chief secretary to the government of Rajasthan. He was a marine engineer, and he has associations with the Rajasthan Cricket Association. He's got a deep interest in languages, culture, economics, history, philosophy, spirituality, and so on. He's the author of a few books now. And, his 6-part series, All Religions Are Not the Same, won critical acclaim. So, notwithstanding, there are many things I can say. Sanjay ji, is it correct? You're also from BITS Pilani in your background.
No, I'm not from BITS Pilani. I did a master's course from there.
Oh, I see.
That is my association from BITS Pilani. BITS Pilani is not my basic alma mater. My basic alma mater is Marine Engineering College, Calcutta.
Calcutta. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And let me also welcome Shri Sai Deepak, who has joined us from India, from Hyderabad, I presume. Sai Deepak ji. And
Yes.
And Sai Deepak ji also needs no introduction, but he's also an engineer. He formerly an engineer from Kharagpur, and a mechanical engineer from Anna University, went on to do law, a bachelor's law degree from IIT Kharagpur. And what he's most famous for is he's gotten involved in a number of very high-profile, constitutionally significant cases in India, including the Shabarimala case, the Padmanabha Swami temple case, and so on. And he's also the author of a very recent, an important, almost a landmark book on the topic of, India, that is Bharat, coloniality, civilization, constitution. And, it's rare to come across a work on the constitution in recent times. And clearly, Sai Deepak ji is breaking new ground on that count. With that brief introduction, Sanjay ji has limited time because he has to go to his own recordings, to his studio. So we're going to begin with him. And Sanjay ji, the topic for today is really an exploration of Hindutva as the attempt to recover indigeneity from the clutches of coloniality. Okay. So, what are the prospects of this attempt to recover and maintain indigeneity in the face of an undistinguished coloniality, which is so prevalent, not only in India, but also around the world? Because coloniality as a phenomenon, the colonial paradigm is so entrenched in the academia all over the world, and including in so much so in India as well. So with that preliminary remarks, I'd like to hand it over to you. What do you think are the prospects and pitfalls of the Hindutva effort to retain and preserve indigeneity amongst the Hindus?
Well, I must say that it's a difficult road. It's not an easy road to traverse. And I would have been, I should say, quite pessimistic if you had asked me the same question about 5 years back. But Right now, I think I need to be quite optimistic, or not just because of the number of works that are coming and addressing the problems that we face, and actually diagnosing them quite well. It wasn't as if it wasn't being diagnosed earlier. People like Rajiv Malhotra have done a lot of background work on that. But what I am quite enthused about is the kind of response that we have started getting. Uh, in fact, I watch this response grow every day. If you look at a platform like the Jaipur Dialogues, also, the Jaipur Dialogues is basically a dialogue platform where we also have some solo discussions, and basically they are generally on deeper topics with a few current affairs thrown in here and there. But even this kind of a platform has generated tremendous interest. And I'm not alone, because there are a lot of others who also generated not just tremendous interest, but they have become viable in their own way, in the sense that the community is supporting them to an extent that they can stand on their own. So the short answer to your question, that you, what are the prospects? I think the prospects are good, so we need to be optimistic. That is one. And you talk about the pitfalls. Well, pitfalls are, I think, the usual pitfalls that we have inherited, and that is the Western lens. And that Western lens continues to stare us in full glare. And that Western lens and the adherence to that Western lens, they continue to be strong, they continue to be well funded, they continue to be well connected to, I should say, not just to a global network, but also now an emerging anti-Hindutva forces, which you all in the Americas have very recently got a taste of. So that, again, in short, so to the two questions that you asked, these are the two short answers.
Okay. Now, it is notable that you have, in the last 5 years, you've moved from being pessimistic to being more optimistic, as you just yourself said, right? Now, and in part, you predicated your optimism on the number of new voices that are emerging, the number of new publications, and also the reception of those voices, the reception of that of these ideas with the younger generation. Now, in particular, I want to speak to you a little bit about the situation of the younger generation in India, because now you're mostly observing India. So, how do you see them participating in this, in the middle of these these tensions between, on the one hand, increasing westernization, modernization, globalization as the appropriate sort of not just the appropriate, the only way forward, versus recovery of the indigenous Hindu civilizational values and culture, and where do you see the younger generation being situated, especially in the wake of the fact that the educational environment in India largely remains consistent with the way it has been since the beginning of independence. Okay, so that's a question for you.
There's something very interesting about the education system. The education system is what it is, and all of us, I think, it has been dissected ad nauseum and pretty much at length. There's something, that I always said, that one thing that I'm pretty, I should say, I should take heart from is that as far as the humanities are concerned, which are the major problems. Basically, if you look at the 30, 40 years in which the Marxists have held sway over the Indian education system. These have also been the years when the student community at large basically neglected the bastions of these humanities people, that is the hardcore humanities, and mostly opted for STEM. And the two people who are sitting here actually are an example of that. At that point of time, when I passed my 12th standards, there were only two options available to any good student, that you would either become an engineer or you would become a doctor. The diversification that is available right now wasn't available at that time. And it is my generation, I reckon, that is principally responsible for the neglect of this Western lens and the neglect of all this headway that the Marxists have made into our education system. But fortunately, the education system has been such, even during schools, even for schools and others, that there was very little incentive to learning, and most of it was rote learning. So whatever we learned, at least I remember, whatever I learned in my school, in the humanities class and the social studies classes, we promptly forgot. We would remember only it as far as the examination was concerned, and after that we would not remember it. So it was only useful to the extent that it allowed you to pass an examination, except for languages where you used to get marks and all that. So that was the extent of damage at that time. But now we need to be even more careful, because the education system as such is more or less disintegrating, in the sense that if everybody is going to get 100% or 90%, people are going to get 90%. So we know what it is, and everything is shifting to the online classes. So therein lies the major pitfall, the major danger, and also a major opportunity. So if you have platforms like Byju's, who openly say that in order to pass civil services, it is mandatory to read the Hindu. That's a major danger. But at the same time, I am quite enthused when I see platforms like Agastya Gurukulam coming and receiving such fantastic response that they have a waiting list running into years. So it is for us, people who are really concerned, to maximize one and minimize the other. So I think right now we are at a crossroads where we can go forward and do really well, and especially talking of reception. If you look at the kind of reception some of the writings have received, I think the corner was turned by its pop genre that was popularized by Amish Tripathi, I must mention. I think that popularized this genre. And then a lot of the books, which are, I should say, they're not really in the pop category. The book, like, for instance, I wrote Unbreaking India. And that was top of the chart, the Amazon tag of bestseller. It continued to enjoy for full 8 or 9 months. And even now, occasionally, it goes into that tag. For instance, the Sai Deepak book, what he has written, India That Is Bharat, well, it's not a book of fiction. And for many people, it may not be an easy read as well. But still, if you look at the kind of response that it has received, it just shows that there is now an ecosystem developing. And that ecosystem needs to be nurtured, needs to be fed, and it needs to be made broad-based also into the Indian languages. That's very important. The language issue is very, very important. Fortunately, the new education policy has recognized it, but we need to see how it gets translated into into reality on the ground. Because having spent 35 years in bureaucracy, I know that the best of intentions do not really get translated into reality on the ground.
Right.
And if the oversight is not good enough, then us bureaucrats, we will make everything into the replica of what was there for the last 30 years.
Right. So, you brought up the new education policy and the fact that some of these new books like Amish Tripathi's and yours and Sai Deepak Ji's are enjoying a level of reception that is very encouraging and ground for optimism, right? At the same time, the absence of educational environments that can systematically and reliably produce scholars, intellectuals of the future, and the reliance on sort of random events, where self-made, self-taught people are writing these books, etc. To what extent do you see that as being an inhibitor, and do you see any good signs of things improving in the general direction of setting up educational institutions and platforms of learning which can more effectively turn the tide of the the shift in the paradigms that's required?
Actually, no, when you mentioned that people who are generally who are not from the genre, who are not really academics, and who, for the love of it, who are writing. Actually, that takes me back to the whole question of coloniality, because it was the coloniality that actually initiated this monopoly on knowledge. The first monopolies on knowledge were actually created by the Western system. And all this peer review system, what peerage is, this peer review system and the what is called the approvals and pats on the back. All this system was developed in order to monopolize knowledge. Because if you look at the Indian system, we had that, that famous shloka, if you remember. Na chauraharyam, na bhratrabhadyam, na rajaharyam, na cha bharakari, vyaye krite vardhate eva nityam, vidyadhanam sarvadhanam pradhanam. So we never placed a premium on monopolizing knowledge. We said, vyaye krite vardhate eva nityam. The more you spend your vidya, the more it will grow. So there was a sea change when the colonial systems came in. They monopolized knowledge, and not just monopolized knowledge, they developed a system of reward and punishment. And that system of reward and punishment is working till today. And that is when that system of reward and punishment comes, that people can simply dismiss a great work by simply saying that, well, he's not qualified, he doesn't have the degree, he hasn't been peer reviewed. Or Audrey Truschke, if somebody asks her, okay, what is the basis for what you're writing? It doesn't have basis in facts. So she said, well, I am trained historian. So that training, so this is the monopoly of knowledge that the coloniality and the later on the colonization that came out of that coloniality, that intention or that mental outlook, that has created that. And we have also willy-nilly, because we remained colonized for a long time, we imbibed that coloniality, and today we are prone to say that. Okay, there is a joke, I remember, I think somebody said, like Osho said this, when he was Acharya Rajneesh. And he gave a fictional example. Look, Kabir wandered onto this earth and just to have a look how people were doing with all his teachings and all that. And then he wandered into a Harvard classroom where they were teaching Kabir. And they somehow recognized him and they honored him, they garlanded him, and they asked him to take a seat. And then the tenured professor started teaching Kabir. And once he started teaching, then after one particular doha, whatever he was saying, Kabir objected, this is not what I meant. So the professor had to tell him, look, you may be Kabir, but you're not authorized to teach. I am the one who's authorized to teach because I have the PhD you don't have. So this actually kind of puts into a very, very bold relief the kind of iniquities that have been bred by the system. So because our Vedas, they do not claim a copyright, they do not say that, okay, this particular Rigveda is authored by X person and Atharva Ved by Y person. And because it is a collective effort, so many people have contributed. So it gets to be ridiculed. You remember that famous quip by Chinmayananda, where you may have one book and the other may have another book, but we have a library. But that library is discounted for this very reason. Because the knowledge monopoly, the system of peer review, the system of copyrights, the system of intellectual property. After Sai is doing, he is basically an advocate in intellectual copyrights. So he would be able to tell us better how these intellectual copyrights came, the intellectual property rights came into being. And Indians were late starters. They did not protect their knowledge in the way that the Westerners protected. Actually, we know now that especially the scientists, people like Dr. C.K. Raju have done seminal work on this and how our knowledge was actually stolen and never given credit. And at the same time, while our knowledge was getting stolen, we were colonized and our initiatives were all suppressed, our economic systems were suppressed and taken advantage of. And there was this tremendous loot, which is now even computed to be something like $45 trillion. All these things combined, that they have produced a kind of situation that we are now in, and we are kind of condemned to study our own past from the Western lens. We are condemned to study our own frameworks from the Western lens. Our own original frameworks have been destroyed. Okay, you mentioned about that little monograph that I have written, all religions are not the same. All religions are not the same. What is my attempt? I'm basically trying to define the frameworks from which we look at our religions, because we always had, of course, Sai has done a great job in designing the OET framework, the ontology, epistemology, theology framework. In my book, I had attempted to show that you cannot look at Indian religions from the intellectual framework of the West, because we know that the Westerners, what they did was that they deliberately took away the spiritual part, or what is called the Paravidya, from the system of the psychology completely. In fact, there is this famous saying, which I think Rajiv Malhotra has also written about it, that in our system of Vak, or you can call it loosely as psychology, we have 4 levels, what we call Vaikari, Madhyama, Pashyanti, and Para. And it was digested by Carl Jung, and he wanted to put it in that framework. But then, as the system then was, he had to get it vetted by the church, and the church got quite alarmed at it, and they said, no, you cannot have this Paravidya, because the moment you have Paravidya, that means the man can become divine, and that is not permissible in the Abrahamic religions. The divinity is reserved, unlike the Indian system, where every person has the potential to become divine himself, to become one with the Brahman. That's not something that is permitted in the Western systems. And therefore, he had to take out the para part, and then he had to philosophize only around the 3 systems up to what is roughly equivalent to our Pashyanti. So these are the kind of things. So we have a framework which is our religions, and not just our religions, even our science was looked at from that point of view. And that was what we call the experiential framework. And that experiential framework is a strict no in the Western system, because one moment you start experiencing the beyond intellect, then objections arise. In the Abrahamic system, God and man and heaven and earth have to be strictly separate. It is a binary system. And they reduce it to a level of intellect. Beyond intellect is not even recognizable there. And even today, when we are trying to recover our indigeneity, sometimes we suffer because we do not recognize that we are again trying to look at it from the same framework that the West has devised for us.
Right.
So that is where the difficulty arises. At work, I analyze it from the point of view uh, our response to the scientific method, because our responsible to scientific method has been very robust, in the sense that the four elements of science that we know, the scientific method, that is verifiability, universality, repeatability, and falsifiability, which is the most important, the falsifiability. Out of this, the Indian systems, all Indian systems, the scientific systems, or the systems of our spiritual systems, all of them recognize this. Even our epistemology, when you talk about direct evidence, the direct evidence is actually greater than the sum of all direct evidence that the West proposes, because that direct evidence also goes into into what is called your inner direct evidence. That's something that it is not even intelligible to the West. Similarly, our logic system is multi-valued. Our whereas in the Western system, even in Western sciences, it used to be binary till quantum physics came on, or till relativity came on. Then, if you look at the our what is called the time, our concept of time, or time concept, the time concept for us, our time concept is cyclical. There's time concept is not just linear but super linear. Somebody like Newton, in fact, went on to exalt it to an extent that ultimately had to be broken down by the relativity and by quantum physics. Our logic is multi-valued in every sense. Many shades of the gray that we have recognized always. So these are the differences that because of our Western education, because of our Western lens, because of the system of knowledge protection, uh, those basics are very often lost on us when we start talking about them. And that makes the task of recovering the indigeneity difficult. So I think now that we've started talking about it, and uh, as I referred to you, that little monograph that I wrote, which I intend to expand into a book form, and what Sai Deepak just did, bringing on a framework from which to analyze both. Those are important initiatives that need to be encouraged in all forms. And of course, we have to counter this whole system of what is called the knowledge barriers that have been built in the form of tenures and degrees and PhDs and things. And how they have to be done, that they have to be thought out, because it can't obviously be a free for all. But then it cannot be the straitjacket that actually restricts the spread of knowledge in the world. And I think with the emergence of the social media, it's getting loosened because a professor with a very high degree at the most can get about 30, 40, 50. Now with the webinar system, maybe can get up to 500 students. But somebody good, if he goes on to YouTube, he can get a lakh views in no time. So that seems to be affecting the popularity and in some sense the legitimacy of these people, but we have to see how it will catch on.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there will be some kind of a pushback from the other side.
Yeah.
So that's what I think in short.
Very good, Sanjay ji. Very good. I want to be mindful of the time for you, and I know you want to go to the next event that you have scheduled. Let me move on to Sai Deepak ji. Sai ji, thank you very much once again for joining this discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, namaskar. And I want to ask you a similar question, which is, Hindutva as an indigenous effort to recover and protect indigeneity from the onslaught of coloniality. Okay, and how do you see that? How do you see its prospects and its pitfalls from your vantage point as a lawyer, as a pleader in the Supreme Court, and the kind of situations you have encountered?
So, first of all, thank you for giving me an opportunity to interact with the patrons of the Hindu University of America. I certainly believe that there is a fair case to be made for Hindutva as a Hindu or a dharmic decolonial movement or a dharmic civilizational reawakening of sorts. And when I make this particular statement, it is capable of being misunderstood as a celebration of victimhood, of perpetual victimhood, when in fact that is not the case. My conscious position has been that it is primarily an identification of a problem followed by a conscious effort to reinscribe values of the past as far as our institutions are concerned, both at the societal level as well as at the state level. Now, I see a lot of comments which rightly harp on the fact that the state has not done enough to empower Hindu indigeneity through the instrumentality of the education system as well as the language policy. I certainly understand where the angst comes from and I endorse it. However, the fact remains that the Hindu society is also equally to be blamed for ceding the civilizational space entirely to the state in the hope that the state will address some of those aspects. Because notwithstanding the best of intentions, every state also happens to be, no matter whichever country you may talk of, also happens to be a typically secularizing entity or a secularizing instrumentality, where it takes away the rigor of the tradition and the core of tradition typically. Therefore, as much as we have to fall back on the state to create a multiplier effect with respect to the indigenous agenda, we must also protect that space from encroachment by the state, because the state has a tendency to succumb to multiple pulls and tugs and multiple calculations in several directions. As a consequence, it typically compromises on certain core values. So, notwithstanding the ideological proclivities of any party which claims to protect and defend and represent Hindu interest, there is always a certain degree of compromise that it is bound to embark upon in order to accommodate non-Hindu interests to increase its reach and base. That is the nature of politics. Therefore, while we must certainly push the state to create a multiplier effect, we must also have our autonomous institutions and self-reliant society-based institutions, which are significantly traditional in their outlook in the sense that they draw from our own repository of thought and philosophy, which are able to sustain our way of life and transmit it. So the object of creation of knowledge and transmission of knowledge must primarily fall in the realm of the society. Now, let me take it to the situation in America for a moment to perhaps make my point better. Because temples in in America are not under state control. They're typically run by the community. And yet we do not have enough examples of Hindu charter schools, while other communities from Asia, such as the Chinese community or the Japanese, have typically managed to run their own educational institutions. And in fact, from what I understand from people who live there, Indians or perhaps Hindu Americans are much more comfortable sending their kids to charter schools run by, let's say, the Chinese or other Asian communities in order to protect whatever remains of their Eastern moorings. And surprisingly, we still don't seem to have the confidence or the wherewithal to establish our own institutions. So my point is, even in a society where there is a significant degree of freedom for the community, the Hindu community, to preserve its institutions and also set up its own educational institutions, there seems to be a marked reluctance on the part of the community to establish its institutions. Because you see, the issues that the Hindu community is saddled with in India are not the issues that the Indian American community is saddled with, or the Hindu American community is saddled with. So what does it say? That perhaps we have comfortably ceded the space on education to someone else in the hope that others will address this issue. And if others can't, we look for the state. So we are comfortable either looking up to the state or other communities of non-Hindu and non-Asian, non-Indian origin to set up an institution, as opposed to setting up institutions ourselves. That is a question that we need to address. And while you certainly have online initiatives and new age initiatives, you need both conventional educational institutions as well as new age educational institutions, which are in a position to make use of both the conventional media as well as the social media, or let's say internet as a platform to disseminate information. So perhaps the Hindu American community can lead the way for the Hindus rest of the world, including in India, by showing us what is it that you can do with the temples and the community's resources at your disposal, by establishing institutions and creating conscious Hindus in a predominantly Protestant Christian environment. So that it is possible for us to ask ourselves a very legitimate question. If Hindus in America can actually do this, living in a white majority, Christian majority country, what is stopping us? Perhaps that's a way of looking back. That's one thing that you can consider. Second, as far as Hindus in India are concerned, I think Sanjay ji made a fantastic point about how new age platforms such as Byju's are rendering school curricula almost redundant and useless. So if children are comfortable consuming content from outside their school textbooks and they're being exposed to everything under the sun, surely they can also be exposed to our own content through apps, through rigorously created curricula, online courses and whatnot. And if the Hindu community is that conscious of retaining its Hindu identity, surely it is possible for them to push their children in this particular direction. Now, the typical answer there is that ultimately there needs to be a certain economic utility for whatever is it that you learn in order for you to have a reason to push your children in that particular direction, because Indian parents are much more conscious of, let's say, the degrees that they ultimately lead to, the practical return on investment that it yields. These are the questions that they ask. So maybe there is a way of introducing points, or let's say introducing content with respect to the Hindu take on sciences, what is popularly called as Vedic mathematics. Whether that is the correct way of referring to it or not, I'm not sure if that's a discussion that perhaps Professor C.K. Raju and Sri Chandrahas Halay are in the best position to address. But whatever is called as Vedic mathematics, or let's say our own let's say notions of science, these are aspects that can be pushed so that students understand that there is a very strong economic utility for them, even if they're looking at a career in STEM, that there is an indigenous contribution which is not just capable of rising up to the standards of the West, assuming that that is the right way of looking at it, but can also give you a much more confident approach to the subject. Because the notion that science is somehow the repository of the West and the sole preserve of the West can be broken by introducing them to this particular curriculum. The problem is, when we speak of Hindu curriculum, we typically focus on history, when we should equally be considering pushing content with respect to Hindu contribution to the concept of science, logic, reason, mathematics, law, whatnot, and medicine. That way, you're giving a very real world, let's say, twist or a real world application, which allow uh, students to overcome the sense of inferiority that they suffer when they go to schools and when they are giving the distinct impression that whatever is it that they learn is something that only the West was aware of. And prior to the introduction of the concept of Western education, we were actually merely learning grammar and Sanskrit and nothing beyond that. What is the logic behind Sanskrit? What is the basis of Vyakarana or grammar in Darshana, in philosophy? Why is Vyakarana treated as such an important part of, let's say, the understanding of Sanskrit or Vedas and Vedangas? Those are deeper concepts that student must be exposed to, because very few languages can actually boast of having a philosophical grounding for their grammar or syntax. Sanskrit can certainly make that particular claim. These are aspects that can be taught through alternative media without necessarily depending on the state. So while we can continue to invest efforts to push the state in a particular direction, we should not treat that as an excuse or a pretext to stop private investment for creating alternative platforms in this day of the internet. When surely students can get hooked to TikTok and PUBG and whatnot, surely there's other content that we can try and push towards them by designing it in a certain addictive fashion. If addiction is the way of pushing harmful content, can we actually make knowledge addictive? Is there a way to hook students to that particular brand of information, that particular content? That is, I think, where the significant amount of ideation needs to be invested in. These are my limited thoughts at this particular point, because while I certainly see a lot of value in creating a larger state-based framework, I'm not someone who is going to wait for the state to take that action. I'm happy to try and create as many private initiatives as possible, where you can consider having some kind of an umbrella Hindu education body, which can support initiatives in multiple directions, look for funding, look for, let's say, content creation, centralized content creation, or let's say each sampradaya finds its own space under the Hindu sky, so to speak, where every sampradaya is entitled to teach its own value-based systems, its own contributions to science, its own contributions to mathematics. We must find a way of doing that. So one of the things that I've been suggesting over the last 2 or 3 weeks is the creation of a World Hindu Congress or a World Hindu Parliament, which is an apolitical civilizational body where multiple organizations can come together with the common intent of pushing the Hindu agenda in all levels, at all platforms, in every direction possible, so that they are able to collaborate with each other, both with respect to resources and content. I mean, both material resources as well as human resources. Is there a way that we can actually do this and maybe draw the basic building blocks of this from the Jewish Congress that was established in the 19th century for the creation of the Israeli state, the Jewish state? So I think there are certain examples that we can certainly draw from without slavishly importing them. I'm merely looking for, let's say, viable models. I think it's time that we started pushing this particular discussion in the realm of specifics and practicalities, because I think the diagnosis of the problem has happened enough. And as Sanjay ji points out, the reception to works authored by others, and dare I say even my work, clearly shows that there is a willing, hungry, captive audience. And I think all that is needed is rigorous investment in creating scholarly content and creating ambassadors who can actually push the content in a very attractive manner and who are articulate expressors of our point of view. That is something that we must seriously consider. Therefore, institutions and individuals both must go hand in hand. And I do believe that the Hindu community, independent of any state support, certainly has the wherewithal, both in the United States as well as in Bharat.
Wonderful. So let me pick up one thread in your discussion. As you rightly pointed out, the Hindu community in the United States of America is certainly free to set up and manage its own institutions, and
Yes.
is not saddled with some of the burdens of the past, as the Hindu community in India is burdened, in Bharat is burdened. Okay, and
Right.
there are some real challenges in India, and which we understand very well. Now, notwithstanding that fact, it is also clearly evident that the mandir, while the Hindu community has established many temples, mandirs, more than 1,000 of them in the United States of America, there has not been a commensurate investment in education, either in
Correct.
setting up schools, other than probably running some Sunday classes and so on. Not enough schools, not enough colleges, universities, not enough chairs, centers, and so on. There is a tremendous disconnect there. Now, I'm just going to wonder if that disconnect is itself a product of coloniality to some extent. And a particular way in which the Hindu community has assimilated coloniality, in the sense that we have learned how to preserve our private religious practice while participating reasonably comfortably with Western educational institutions.
Right.
And the argument has become, why create our own institution as long as we can maintain our Hindu identity at home and in our community? But simply, let's just simply take advantage of Western institutions. And what do you see? What do you see in this argument as a product of coloniality and the way forward?
So, one, I think the Hindu American community, whether consciously or unconsciously, takes extreme pride in having assimilated into the Western structure. And therefore, there is a model minorityhood, which is a clear product of coloniality. Okay, so that is something that needs to be understood, which means that you have consciously relegated religion to the private space when everybody else is more than comfortable mainstreaming it through the course of their education to preserve their values. And since you have benefited from Western education by now becoming model minorities within the Western economic setup, you don't see any incentive or real value in significantly investing in producing what I would call as Hindu education, because there are patterns of sensing and patterns of learning that are unique to the Hindu approach, which is extremely experiential in nature. So colonial consciousness is clearly one of the issues. And therefore, I've always believed that the lessons with respect to decoloniality are obviously more imperative and important for the educated Hindus as opposed to the uneducated Hindu, because the uneducated Hindu, thanks to the fact that he's not been educated through the modern education system, continues to be significantly decolonial as in his default mode. But it's the educated Hindu who is fundamentally colonial. And the more educated they are and the more integrated they are in the Western system, the more colonial they are in their approach. And they compartmentalize their notions of religion, dharma, and their notions of what has real world value, what has economic value, and what gives them the greenbacks. And since STEM is ultimately seen as the primary route to achieve that model minorityhood, you have also simultaneously sidelined humanities, as a consequence of which humanities in the United States, notwithstanding the best of brains which reside in that particular place within the Hindu American community, has also been ceded to the white Christian or the white Jew, as the case may be, with Audrey Tushke being the point, a case in point. Okay, so a colonial consciousness is certainly present, I believe, in the Hindu diaspora.
All right. So I don't know if she will come back, since he said that there is a battery problem. Let me generally ask the audience, if you could kindly put your questions in the Q&A box, we'll try to answer them. Dr. Bikram Paul is asking from Bethesda, Maryland, is there any effort program by the Ministry of Education, Culture, educators in India for the revival of Sanskrit and Vedic culture education in India? Yeah, there are some efforts. There are two sides to the story. One is the efforts are not enough. And the other side is, of course, there is too much Hindutva, too much effort being placed, depending on who you ask. But from the Hindu perspective, certainly there can be more. I think there will be an honest assessment of the situation. Let's see. Is there a way to be pro-Hindu advocate without being perceived as being anti-Muslim? Yeah, you see, the problem is, the perception of being anti-Muslim is a matter of tremendous propaganda, right? So there are people, there are investments, there are monies, there are careers being made out of perpetuating the propaganda that the Hindu, by being Hindu, is automatically anti-Muslim or anti-Christian and so on. Whereas the exact opposite is true. It is the Muslim and the Christian who is axiomatically, fundamentally, theologically anti-Hindu. You see, so it is like crying foul, 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 while you're the one who's committing is yourself who's committing the foul to begin with, right? So is there a way of being a pro-Hindu today, and a strong Hindu who is not perceived as being anti-Muslim? My answer is no. People will start attacking you as anti-Muslim immediately as soon as you speak up. So the only way of being a pro-Hindu advocate without being perceived as being anti-Muslim is to shut up and never speak. Then, of course, you will be successful in ensuring that you don't invite any criticism. But in effect, that would have silenced you, which is exactly what Hindu dvesha, Hindu phobia is all about. How do you find programs? Let me move on to the next question, okay? How do you find programs in India for Hindutva education? I don't know. Honestly. I can't speak for how do you find programs in India. There certainly I can say there needs to be a lot more, a great many more than there are. Nina Narumanchi, when I attend these webinars, these amazing books, I see a barrier to getting this message to the common. Yeah, see, so what do you call common man, right? Common person, common Hindu, largely is a secularized individual who is concerned with their their personal lives most of all, and therefore the percentage of people who are deeply interested, deeply committed to these issues continues to be relatively small, and there is a barrier on that count, and we need to do more on that front, certainly. Varadrajan is saying we're not a homogeneous lot. As Hindus, it is necessary to follow Sai Deepak's ideas of private education. Yeah, I think Hindus will never be a homogeneous lot, but I do think they can create shared platforms if they begin to recognize the significance of those platforms. Okay, very few public schools in the US teaching Indian languages. Yeah, I think we need to create teachers first, knowledgeable teachers, knowledgeable expert teachers. That is the beginning, and then of course there needs to be investments in those directions. Jayasri saying there needs to be a Hindu curriculum that needs to be developed along with current syllabus. Yeah, definitely, yes. Okay, hold on. I'm kind of, there's a lot of things flowing up here. Yeah, Srilataji. So without properly appreciating the place of ritual and custom within the Hindu traditions, and being able to provide an appropriate explanation and defense of it, it'll be very hard because it is the object of the other ideologies, the other paradigms, to continually interrogate Hinduism as being primitive and outdated and obsolete and so on and so forth. So you will always be on the defensive end of that question until you get educated yourself. Language is difficult to understand. Nina Narumanchi. Yeah. Okay. See, the what you are talking about, Nina ji, is that it's the language that we are using in the academic environment. You're correct that it needs to be simplified, and again that requires good teachers, credentialed, qualified teachers who can take this knowledge, first of all, grounding themselves in it, and then being able to repurpose it for a younger audience. Okay, and we really hope that will happen more and more in the future. The temples have lots of money, yeah, but it is controlled by them. Money is still controlled by the government. In India, there's a lot of government intervention in how things happen. Not so much in the US, but Saiji's point was very good. What he said was, notwithstanding the fact that Hindu temples in the United States are not under government control, they still don't invest in education. And what do you have to say? At least in India, there may be an excuse that the government is interfering too much in Hindu institutions.